Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Deborah Davis. I'm the president of the Women's History Project and one of the co-founders. And in advance of Sunday, happy International Women's Day. This is a time to celebrate the progress made in advancing women's rights and highlight ongoing efforts. International Women's Day started in actually 1911 in March in Austria, Denmark, Germany, and Switzerland. And over time, other countries joined them. And in 1975, the United Nations recognized International Women's Year and began celebrating March 8th as International Women's Day. Today, International Women's Day is a day of unity, celebration, reflection, and advocacy. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to our panelists who will be presenting today. Today, we had 95 people register for our activities, and we're just delighted with those numbers. This morning at work, I was asked to do a short presentation about the Women's History Project in advance of International Women's Day. And it was a chance to quickly reflect on our work since we launched in April 22nd, 2022. We have a considerable events program, online and in person, gathering panels and speakers of outstanding caliber across many different topics. We have our flagship, 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories, and our digital products on our social media channels in Substack, which you just saw in the video. Women just didn't arrive in 2026 on our own with full rights and privileges. There are a great many women who challenged the status quo, who advanced public policy, women's voices who made a difference. And we stand on their shoulders and we thank them. And the Women's History Project didn't arrive just by itself either. I want to thank our volunteer board. I want to thank our part-time staff and early funders, contributors, and donors, including Nancy's own and the Ontario English Catholic Teachers Association in particular. We have much more work to do to make the Women's History Project sustainable, and my heartfelt thanks to those who attend our events and to those who support us. In advance, I'd like to thank Marian Polak, who's going to be our moderator today, and to our outstanding group of panelists. Marian is a retired postal worker and former activist in the Canadian Union of Postal Workers in Vancouver, BC. She held elected positions locally, regionally, and nationally in CUPW, but her most important role was that of a CUPW shop steward. And with a group of other people, she worked for gender equality in her union, the workplace, and the labor movement. She was a member of CUPW's National Women's Committee for over 9 years. She was active in the 1981 strike, which resulted in paid maternity leave for postal workers. She was a board member and past president of the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women, CREA, who was one of our partners in our startup years. So thank you to CREA. I can attest, Marian, the good work that they do really helped us. In her retirement, Marian works to protect defined benefit pensions and to advocate for justice and fairness for seniors. She is involved in the 411 Senior Centre in Vancouver. So I'd like to ask Marian to come and say a few words and then introduce our panelist. Marian, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and happy International Women's Day. Most of us go to work on a daily basis, but we don't think about the big and the little fights that made it much easier and much safer and much more equal for us to work. And these fights range from being able to wear pants to work, not just dresses, not having to make tea and coffee for the men at work, even naming sexual harassment. When I first started, we had no name for sexual harassment. And without a name, it was really hard to identify and talk about, and to other struggles for pay equity, for healthier and safer workplaces, for paid maternity leave, and many other fights, big and small. And we have just an amazing group of panelists who are going to talk about it. They're so amazing that I actually have to read their bios because they're so wonderfully accomplished. There is not a time for people to ask questions, but if you put your questions in the chat, people will be monitoring it and they'll be able to either get back to you or put you in contact. So, I'm in awe of these panelists, and by the end of the day, I hope you will be too. So I'll introduce them in order, and then they're going to speak, and then we're going to have some discussion. Our first panelist is Dr. Joan Sangster. She's a Vanier Professor Emeritus at Trent University in Peterborough, where she taught history, Canadian studies, gender and women's studies. A fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and past president of the Canadian Historical Association, she held visiting fellowships at McGill, Duke, and Princeton universities. She's written 8 books, co-edited 7 essay collections, and published chapters and articles dealing with working women, the labor movement, suffrage movements, women in the law, Indigenous and settler relations, and feminist historiography. Her book, Earning Respect, The Lives of Working Women in Small Town Ontario, won the Canada Prize, and one of her books, Transforming Labor, Women in Work and Post-War Canada, won an honorable mention for the CHA History Prize. Her recent Demanding Equality, A History of Canadian Feminism, secured the Hilda Neatby Prize for the best book on women and gender history. The book offers an overview of Canadian feminism, which argues for politically multivocal hybrid character of equality-seeking women's movements in Canada. And she's been an associate and co-editor of Labor Studies, Working Class Histories of the Americas, and Canadian Labor Literature. Our second speaker will be Pam Sugiman. She's a professor of sociology and an oral historian. Her work has been inspired by a passionate interest in the memories and lives of working class people in Canada, with a sensitivity to intersectional identity and experiences. In her early research, she documented the emergence of working class unionism, trade union, and feminism, and analysis of women who were employed in the auto manufacturing plants from 1917 to the late 1970s. Following this, she studied the lives of Black men who were employed in auto foundries in southern Ontario through this 20th century, places where they performed extremely dangerous and arduous jobs. Most of her subsequent writing has explored personal memory and oral history with a focus on the Second World War, internment and forced resettlement, and assimilation of Canadians of Japanese ancestry. Presently, she's co-director of a new collaboration project on women's activism in Canada and the creation and preservation of oral histories with grassroots women who have been marginalized from public history. And this includes the histories of feminist movements for change. So these are 2 great women, and we got 2 more. Dr. Leslie Nichols is an assistant professor in the School of Social Sciences at Laurentian University. Her career in women and work began with a study of mothers facing unemployment for her doctorate in policy studies from Toronto Metropolitan University. Dr. Nichols has explored a range of Canadian equity deserving work and workplace-related concerns. Her edited book, Women Working in Canada, An Intersectional Approach, was published in 2019 by the Canadian Scholars Press, and her most recent publication focused on one-time poverty, women, the COVID-19 pandemic, and social justice, and it was published in 2025 in Studies in Social Justice. And our last amazing presenter is Dr. Julia Smith. She's an associate professor in the Labor Studies program at the University of Manitoba on Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Her research and teaching focus on the history of politics of work, unions, labor relations, and feminism activism in Canada. She's also a member of the Graphic History Collective and co-author of several graphic history-related books. Julia studies the history and politics of work, unions, labor relations, and feminist activism in Canada. So it's a pretty amazing panel. But before I turn to the panel, I would be remiss if not acknowledging that I come from the stolen and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish in Vancouver. And I know that a number of people were settlers on Indigenous territories throughout, from coast to coast to coast. So firstly, I'll turn this over to Dr. Joan Sangster.
Hi to everybody, and thank you first to the Women's History Project for putting this session together on women's labor. When you think about it, women's history is labor history, since the vast majority of women have worked always, although in different places. And I think focusing on labor allows us to think about the way in which women's search for equality was connected to labor, to work, to feminism, and to other social movements. And in fact, connecting those areas of activism was what first inspired me to begin writing women's labor history in the 1970s, an exciting time when a lot of connections were being made between those movements. My research has changed a lot over the decades, but I tried to draw out a few questions which come up again and again, whether I was looking at the criminalization of poor and Indigenous girls, women workers demanding equality, or the changing face of feminism, which I think was very hybrid, polyphonic, and multi-voiced. So I'm just going to touch on 4 of those questions which we might come up in our discussion. First of all, how and why have women tried to change their paid and unpaid work? I think we need to think about the social and economic conditions which framed their lives and the dominant ideas of the time, and then think about what gave them the courage, the foresight, the determination to go against the grain, go against that grain. And their actions, I think somebody said, could be small and fleeting as well as big. And sometimes those fleeting actions turn into something more. So, for example, when I was looking at women's unions in the 1950s, I found that a lot of women were using the grievance procedure to try and get maternity leave. And of course, it wasn't legal at that point. That was just them, working mothers, dealing with the economic stresses in their lives, as well as having children, trying to use any method possible to get what they should have deserved, which is mat leave. Second, I think thinking about labor can also help us to abandon that pernicious wave metaphor that we often use, myself included, about feminism. I think it's problematic because it assumes that what came in between the waves was some trough of inactivity, which was certainly not the case. And in fact, I think, to take one example, that after the suffrage struggle, when many, although not all, women got the vote, women actually turned their sights afterwards to fighting for various economic rights. So we don't want to lose that history by talking about troughs. Third, I think that when we're talking about women's search for equality, we really have to delve into gender, class, ethnic, and race relations. Not thinking about how those detract from feminism, but how they enrich our understanding of women's history. Feminists did not always agree, and their experiences of work were really, frankly, often very different. Sometimes they came together in coalitions for things like equal pay or married women's right to work during the 1930s, but sometimes they were quite divided. And especially women, racialized women, for example, developed their own distinct voices of protest. And I think there's no other way to understand World War II, for example, and African Canadian women without reminding ourselves that many of those women were fighting just to get factory jobs, which had been denied them to the past as they were relegated to service and domestic work. Fourth, last and not least, I think we continually need to think about the sources we're going to use for women's labor history and how we're going to get that message out in a wide audience, perhaps in a popular way. Sometimes, as I said, women's struggles were hidden and fleeting. They weren't always big court cases or public events. And as feminist historians, we have tried using many things. All of us here, I know, have archives, newspapers, government documents, legal cases, prison records, novels, memoirs, And I think we have to continue to use all of those because they all give us a little piece of the picture. And we have to continue to find ways to popularize and advertise women's labor history. Along with other people on this call, Pam and Julia, I'm involved in an oral history project right now, looking at women's movements from the 1960s to the 1990s. And I think, just to close, that is a method which will help us preserve some of those hidden histories from women who didn't always take the time to write about their lives. They didn't have the time or the energy, about women who were not in leadership positions. And it will tell us a lot about their day-to-day lives and also why they chose to buck the status quo. So thank you very much.
That was great. It sort of has made me sort of think about some of the struggles in my union and how sometimes some of the brother, not only how the brothers fought against us, but how right after World War II, they brought in pay equity, or right during for women, not because they wanted women to be paid fairly, but because it was an attempt to keep women out of the workplace. The next speaker is Pam Sugiman, who really talks about, has a real great intersectional lens.
Thanks, Marian, and thank you, Deborah, for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I look forward to the discussions. I'll just talk a little bit about some of the research that I've done. In my early research as a doctoral student, I wanted to understand why and how some sectors of the economy, such as auto manufacturing in the province of Ontario, were dominated by men and remained so for many, many, many decades. And exploring these broad questions about sex segregation, I discovered that small pockets of women did in fact work in some male-dominated and highly masculinized industries. They worked in these industries at various points in time, even prior to the Second World War. I think many of us have heard about Rosie the Riveter during the Second World War, but there were women in these plants long before that time, and they all didn't work in munitions either. So I interviewed a lot of women. In interviews with these women auto workers, I asked what life was like for them in the auto plants. And in particular, I wanted to know about how they were treated in their own words, how they were treated both by their employers and, as Marian mentioned, how they were treated by their union brothers. Importantly, they told me about not only about the ways in which they were often unfairly treated, but the ways in which they resisted unfair treatment. And the ways in which they did resist really did change over time. So I look at women workers not fixed in time, not one group of workers, but generations of women workers and how they built on one another's resistance. And one of the contributions of my early research, and I have Joan Sangster to thank for bringing this to my attention. She may not remember this, but she had invited me to Trent University to give a talk, and she described my research as a documentation of the emergence of working class feminism or feminist trade unionism. And I hadn't, even up until that point, thought about it in that way. And that made sense. Feminist trade unionism in its early days was distinct from, but not detached from, middle-class feminism and middle-class feminists. And that's important to know, because many people are under the belief that, have the belief that these are distinct groups, but they did collaborate. They worked together in their protest. Now, 36 years later, after I finished that research, I've decided to re-listen to some of my old interviews with those 37 women auto workers that I had interviewed in 1990. All of these women have sadly long since died, but their voices are still alive. So in 2026, I am re-listening to women workers speak with me in 1990 about their memories of work from as early as 1937, right up until the 1970s. So I'm moving through time in this new research. And my basic question is how interviews withstand the passage of time. And more specifically, how do I, and I now call myself an oral historian, but I don't think I called myself an oral historian back in the 1990s. How do I, as an oral historian, at a later stage in my life and a later point in time, interpret the women's words with a new language of feminism and a new understanding of feminism and in a very different social, political, and economic setting? And what is important as part of this research as well is, as an oral historian, what is important to me is orality. That is an AURALITY. So I am now listening to the voices of the women themselves and can also see the ways in which I intervened as the researcher and shaped their narratives. And as Joan mentioned, I'm also involved in a collaborative project, and we're trying to find ways in which we can bring to public history, or to the public, to a larger audience, the struggles, the experiences, the voices of groups of women workers women generally, and I'm focusing on women workers as part of the labor and poverty group who have been marginalized from history. And that's where I bring my respect for and understanding of intersectionality to this new research. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think a theme is emerging. Women have always worked in places that people don't think we have worked. Women have always resisted, and we need to pay special attention to the stories of marginalized women. So the next speaker is Dr. Leslie Nichols. Over to you.
Thank you very much for everyone attending, as well as those involved in the Women's History Project. Thank you again for Deborah and Ellen and those beyond. I just want to highlight a couple things I've been doing more recently in terms of my research. I have researched the experience of women's paid and unpaid labor through an intersectional lens. And this work uncovers the difficulties and policy injustices related to ethnicity, newcomer status, precarious employment, single parenthood, and youth. And in an economy that has forced institutions to do more with less, I found, for example, that universities were meeting teaching requirements with adjunct instructors who were recently completed their PhD rather than hiring full-time tenure-track professors. And these adjuncts are hired course by course and are faced with precarious employment and remarkably lack university support amongst a range of different factors. And they often tend to be women who, at that time, because of childbearing needs, are often dealing with competing demands to try to navigate and often then stuck in a continuing uncertainty of adjunct status. Also, during the Ontario's COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns, I found that women in families with children did significantly more home and child-related care work than did their male spouse, in the case of the study. And as a result, they faced more overwhelming feelings of time poverty, a lack of time for themselves. And this is a prime example of women's multiple roles during a time of crisis, which leaves them with little or no leisure or recuperation time and space. And I've argued that this is an important social justice issue. While there has been significant attention to women in work in the literature and in society as a whole, there has been also discourse that women are becoming more increasingly equal in status, salaries, and workloads. My work shows that there are many hidden points of knowledge remaining, revealing situations in which women are demonstrably not equal and continuing an old age societal struggle. Without acknowledging the progress, we will not make anything change. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was great. When I started as a unionist, we talked about women having, we had two jobs. We had to work in the family and we worked in the workplace, and sometimes, and then if we were involved in our union. And you're telling us after all these years, it really hasn't changed much. So I think it's a really important discussion, but kind of depressing. Over to you, Julia.
So let's see if I can talk about some of the success stories then in my comments. So I'll start off by just saying I'm in Winnipeg, as Marion said, and the neighborhood I live in Winnipeg, for those who are on the call from Winnipeg, I don't know. I'm like an internet black hole when the clouds show up. So if I freeze, I will be here and I will be back. But I'm just going to say in advance, it's a cloudy day here today, and I've been freezing on Zoom calls. So apologies if that happens. So I'll echo what everyone else has said here. The thanks to Marion for the introduction and for chairing and for providing your comments and expertise too, Marion. So I mean, you could be on here as a panelist alongside us. So it's great to have you here. And then thanks to Deborah, Ellen, Tiff, and everyone else in the Women's History Project for organizing this panel and for all the work it sounds like you folks have been doing. And then thanks to everyone else for being here. You know, it does take effort to join an online webinar at the end of a workday. So thanks to everyone for joining and being here. So as Marion mentioned there, I'm an associate professor in the labor studies program at the University of Manitoba. And for those of you who don't know, labor studies is an interdisciplinary field of study that focuses on work and unions. Some of my colleagues make the joke that people think we're in midwifery. I had never heard that before, but since moving to Manitoba, multiple people have asked me that. So I just now always start off by clarifying. It's a different kind of labor. That kind of labor is equally as important, if not more. But we're looking at work and unions. And what that means when we say interdisciplinary field is just that we draw on a range of disciplines and fields to examine issues related to all aspects of work and the labor movement. And it's been a great home for me academically because, like many of my co-panelists here, you know, you just heard Pam, Leslie, and Joan talk. Many people who are studying, you know, women's labor history. Yes, we might be historians, although Pam, I think you're technically sociologist, right, as your PhD. You know, but we cross disciplines, right? So yes, we're looking at the past. That's what kind of unites us, I think. But it's great to have these interdisciplinary conversations because the work is being done not just in history departments or museums. So I'm interested in feminist movements as labor unions as these powerful tools through which people have, and I would say can, advance social justice and equality in Canada. And so much of my research has focused on the history and politics of women's labor activism in Canada. And again, I'll just say a little bit about my work, and then you'll see that there'll kind of a lot of crisscrossing with other people's who have already spoken, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So in my early work, I examined a feminist union that organized workers in British Columbia in the 1970s and 80s, which was the Service Office and Retail Workers Union of Canada, or SORWOC. And I was looking at this basically to demonstrate the benefits and limitations of alternative unions. So again, some of you will be familiar with SORWOC, some of you might not, but essentially they were a small grassroots independent union that organized predominantly or primarily in predominantly female industries. But they received the most attention for their efforts to unionize the banking industry. So this was in the 1970s. There'd been a few attempts before by big established labor unions, and they hadn't really gone anywhere. And then all of a sudden, this like independent union that many people hadn't heard of achieved one of the things that people thought was impossible, which was a certification in the banking industry. So I won't go into all the details about that, but suffice to say, if you're in Canada, you know that the banking industry sadly remains largely non-unionized today. So it's a bit of a sad story there, but the positive is that, you know, SORWOC's initial success, they did end up with several hundred members in bargaining units. You know, they did what many commentators, both in the union movement and employers, and even the labor boards, had basically kind of thought of as impossible. And so, you know, I've argued that that initial success, where others had either failed or not even tried, you know, speaks to the potential of feminist union organizing. And we can see evidence of this in other areas, and that's kind of what I've been doing over the last few years since that initial project. So in addition to my work on SORWOC and the banks, I've also looked at feminist labor activism in other unions and industries. So I'm currently working on a project that examines a very big, broad project, as you'll hear, the politics, strategies, and experiences of women who advance gender equality through labor organizing in Canada in the second half of the 20th century. And so with this project, this very broad project right now, I'm interested in looking at how women from a diversity of backgrounds viewed unions as political tools, and also how they understood and negotiated the labor relations system. So the activists that I'm studying, you know, they all viewed unionization as a way for women to improve their lives. And I think often when we talk about this, whether we say, you know, labor feminists, union feminists, working class feminists, you know, oftentimes it's viewed, I think, as like a homogenous group, you know, okay, these were all one type of woman. But in fact, when you look, there was, like any, you know, social movement, there was divisions, debates. People came from different backgrounds. They've had different political orientations. So essentially, I'm just interested in looking at the diversity of women who, we view as kind of feminist union activists, and look at kind of different paths they took to that and what they accomplished. The last thing I'll say is just that I've also been looking at this with colleagues on different industries. So for the past few years, Joan and I have been looking at the work experiences and labor militancy of flight attendants and their interactions with the labor relations system. And so there we've looked at a range of things, and we can chat more in the discussion if we like. So we've looked at how flight attendants use the grievance system to resist management regulation of their bodies, how airlines have used women workers to market air travel and how flight attendants push back against that, and also how airlines use the labor relations system to silence feminist labor activists. And so that's an ongoing project that's been really interesting, and I mean, especially topical given the strike by Air Canada flight attendants just in the summer. And then lastly, I've also been looking at how some of these dynamics have played out in the childcare sector. So with my colleague Lisa Pizzoli, who's at Queen's, we've looked at basically how the unique kind of politics around childcare work complicates these workers' efforts to unionize in particular ways. And specifically what we found is that even when childcare workers manage to unionize, they struggle to negotiate improvements in their wages and working conditions. And this is due in part to employers, parents, and state officials undervaluing of caring labor. And again, we can do a whole panel on just that topic, right? It's viewed as women's work that's done just for love and therefore not worthy of adequate compensation. And so what this shows is that, these legal challenges, fighting just to get a union, is just one part of this multifaceted struggle that care workers have been engaged in to have their work respected and valued. And so I'll leave it there, and as you say, I'm looking forward to having this conversation with everyone about kind of, different struggles that women have engaged in to improve their working conditions. And I would argue, society for all of us, because many of these struggles that we're talking about have ripple effects for the rest of us. Thank you.
This is great. I mean, I remember many SOROC meetings, and I think it's really, and I think it's really interesting to talk about when you were talking about yours and Joan's stuff about flight attendants. I thought, oh my goodness, this is so interesting. I want to read it, but what I want to do now is hear from the panelists to talk about some key movements and moments in history of women and work. And when you look at the historical record, what forms of resistance have been overlooked, misunderstood, and have been successful? Because often we don't talk about which ones have been successful. So whichever one of you wonderful women want to go first, please start. If not, I'll have to talk, so please.
We could just go in the same order. Joan, you go first, and then we can Pam, and then lastly me. That's easy.
Thank you, Julia. I don't really like going first. So the question is, what forms of resistance have been overlooked? Let me try and think of one or two. One thing I'd say is forms of hybrid resistance. I mean, we often think about movements for gender equality that focus primarily on issues of gender. But in fact, some of the most vibrant times have been when movements come together in an alliance. Feminism, people from the labor movement, and often people from the left as well, who have a very different, more utopian vision of society. And they create a kind of momentum behind various issues. And so I think just thinking about hybrid resistance is a way to think more broadly about resistance. Women didn't always have, one goal. And I'll try and think of one or two examples, but here's one. I mean, sometimes, as I said, people think about the 1920s and 30s as a kind of downtime in terms of women's politics, but it was actually a time when women were finding new ways to fight for economic equality. But not all of these fights were the same. And one involved African Canadian women, especially in Ontario and Nova Scotia, starting to fight so that their daughters could go to nursing school. It's pretty basic, but in Ontario, a group in Windsor, and in Nova Scotia, a group particularly led by Pearline Oliver, started this fight, writing to governments and so on, trying to pressure to allow young African Canadian women to go to nursing school. And of course, it was just clearly a racial barrier that had to be overcome and wasn't until the 1940s or even after. But there's a hybrid struggle that involved both a movement for racial equality and a gendered objective for women's equality. And I think you can think about other examples like that, where people have come together in various alliances and have moved move the struggle forward. I mean, I'll leave it there because other people might want to throw in an example as well.
Pam,
Well,
do you wanna?
yeah. So I think you had asked about key moments, Marian. Well, I'll start with the key moments, but within the sector that I studied, I could see, first of all, the entry of more women into certain types of work that have been very much dominated by men. The right of married women to keep their jobs. And I don't know if many people are younger people are aware of that. In the past, once a woman was married, she had to leave the job, or she would be told to leave the job. And so many women, I mean, this is resistance again in very small ways. They they took off their wedding rings. They would get married on the weekend and then on Monday return to work, but put the wedding ring in their pocket so that no employers wouldn't know. The right of married women to keep their jobs is very significant. There was a really strong binary between men and women, and nothing. And we know that these are social constructs, and there wasn't discussion of any identity or any in between or merging, and this binary manifested itself even in collective agreements and employment contracts where there would be male seniority and female seniority, and then married women's up until a certain time, married women's seniority, male job classifications, female job classifications, and therefore male rates of pay for a job and female rates of pay for a job. So the elimination, the erosion, all of that over time is really significant. Secondly, I think you asked about forms of resistance that have been overlooked or misunderstood. I'll just repeat what I said earlier. I think that it's not that women never had a voice. It's just that no one listened to them. They certainly had a voice, and they voiced their complaints. And earlier in time in workplaces, they complained about, well, I think that most complaints were about being timed on the job. That's extremely stressful. There were speed ups production quotas in manufacturing, and this was a constant source of complaint among the women. They were even timed when they would go into the washroom because and that's also humiliating. So they protested that. I think there was also a mistaken assumption that women earlier in time, I mean, had to disrupt gendered culture in order to receive rights, because a lot of women did not disrupt gendered culture, but they still fought for their rights. So I'll leave it at that.
This reminds me so much of in the post office. It wasn't until about 1956 married women could work. But what you're saying is married women did work. They just hid that they were married. But it wasn't until the mid 70s that pensions were equalized through men and women. But it wasn't until 76 where if a man died, his family would get pension, survivor's benefits. But because women, we were just working for pin money, our families, if we passed away, wouldn't get pensions. So it's so interesting. And I think I'd like to come back and talk about a pay equity, because I still think there are de facto different men and women's job job classifications. But Leslie, over to you.
So thank you again for all your comments so far about this question. I would essentially go off what Marion just said about Canada postal workers and the maternity leave and how that developed and flourished as a result of the 1981 strike, when Parrott brought in the part-time workers that tend to be more females, and then tried to advocate by also combining with the women's movement at the time to try to make change. And that was a significant moment, even though still I would say there's a lot more to go for maternity leave, because the 18 months to be gender equity is not sustainable for most individuals for the amount you receive. So there's a lot more that should be done, but at least that was a significant moment to make change, especially in comparison to other countries. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, Julia.
Yeah, so thanks everyone for their comments, lots of interesting things. So I guess I'll start with the key moments and just building off what Leslie just said there. I mean, I think again, the thing about the CUPW strike over maternity leave that also I think is so important to remember is, to me, it's such an powerful example of the solidarity, right? It wasn't just female CUPW members who were out on those picket lines, right? It was everybody came together. Well, not everybody, I'm sure there were some dissenters, but enough members decided they were committed to that and to walking off the job and staying out over that issue. And so I think that's something that's really important. And also, I saw in the chat that people were asking about, the role of men in all of this. And I think that's something that, like, so many of these conversations focus on, like, what are women going to do to solve women's problems? Well, let's be honest, if we flip it, so a lot of these problems are problems caused by patriarchy. So it's like, what are men going to do about solving these problems? So, how are they going to help the work along? So I think that's really important. I was going to say too, and I think someone referenced earlier, Marion, I think it was you actually. One that sticks out to me is not so much, again, a movement that's been overlooked, or just a key one, is sexual harassment. I think it's difficult. I'm born in 1982. That term has existed my whole life. And I know when I tell students about the fact how recently it was coined, like, obviously the behavior was always there. The problem was always there. I think it's difficult for people to comprehend that there was a time before that existed, the naming of it, and the fact that, so I just think that's such an important piece. And at least in the areas that I look at, I mean, Joan, you would say the same, right? Flight attendants is a huge issue, but for so many of these jobs, regardless of the nature of work, I'm sure, Pam, you would say the same in the auto industry, right? It's not just predominantly female sectors, like sexual harassment, it cuts across. Oh, sorry, again, it's my internet. I'm so sorry. It's a Winnipeg audio issue. Blame Winnipeg. But hopefully you can hear me. But basically just this identifying of sexual harassment and efforts to tackle that. And while we still have lots of work to do on this, I think it was such an important moment, and it is still such an important thing because it cuts across so many jobs and categories, class, everything. So I would just highlight that. And then in terms of forms of resistance that are overlooked, I guess I'm taking a little bit of a different, I'm flipping it a little bit in the sense that one of the things with SORWAC that it's gotten better in recent years, but it always bothered me when I was first studying them was, they're identified as a women's union, as a feminist union. And basically it was like, that's why they're important for women's history. And it's interesting because they kind of got cut out of labor history and the history of labor activism. And I always found that very frustrating. And I know this gets at kind of that divide about, women's studies. Do we have women's studies as a standalone department, or do we kind of try and, like, infiltrate all programs? How do you do this? And I just think it deprives the labor movement and labor activists of this rich history of feminist organizing if we view that kind of energy and activism as kind of siloed, like, well, that was the feminist movement. And just to tell you, it played out at all levels, right down to when SORWAC applied for their first certification. The labor board spends a significant amount of the initial hearing debating whether or not they're even a union. Like, basically, they seem like they're a little feminist. I think they might just be a women's group masquerading as a union. Now, whether that would happen today, I don't know, but I just always find that really interesting. So I wouldn't say so much overlooked in the history of feminism, because I think, as Marion said, right, there was actually a lot of solidarity between feminist movements and SORWAC members. But I would say in terms of feminist contributions being overlooked in other areas. And like I said, I think that does a real disservice because we miss out on, as I said about the banks, but other groups, Joan and I are talking about the flight attendants, some really innovative forms of organizing and resistance that if we silo it off into, that's just women's labor history, that I think we're poorer for it because we're missing out on some really successful tactics. I hope that came through and it wasn't just me frozen the whole time.
Yeah, Yeah. I just want to say, in terms of the CVW struggle for maternity leave, in the union, it was women who really pushed it were women who had come from or felt part of the women's movement, women who would clearly identify as feminists. And, I mean, there was some privilege that went along with this. Most of the women who did so didn't have kids. We were white women, so we had, additional privilege. But one of my, it makes me cry to this day, is I'm on the picket line and one of my coworkers comes up, this is 1981, with his picket sign, pats his belly and says, "This is for you." And I thought, that was like such a wonderful memory of solidarity. But I think we talked about, flight attendants, and given the strikes and given that, all of us have seen how flight attendants, were sexualized and things like that. I'd love to hear from Joan and Julia about some of your research and your findings.
There's a lot there. Let me think. I want to talk maybe about one example of something we've written about, because I think that example says a lot, and it answers some of the general questions about what were the barriers to women organizing and so on. One of the things we looked at was a legal battle in 1987 when a woman, Senka Dukovic, who was a feminist and a labor activist and also a lawyer, worked for Wardair, and the Women's Committee of the union at that time decided to take a human rights case forward. It would have been a federal case on the basis of sex discrimination in the whole industry. And they talked about race, they talked about the sexualization of women, gender discrimination. And when Senka was talking to the press about this, she made the comment that airlines like their flight attendants, what was it, Julia? Sexy.
Squeaky clean sex objects.
So they wanted them to be the girl next door, but they wanted to sexualize them as well. And she was immediately punished by her employer, who gave her a 2-week unpaid suspension. And the union, their union at the time was, by this time, QP, fought it and lost in the Canadian Labor Relations Board. And I think all the things around this grievance are very interesting, because at the time when feminists made these kind of comments, they weren't accepted in the way we would accept them today. Comments about the sexualization of women's jobs, how women were marketed, and so on. It was almost taken for granted by some people. So they really were leading the way in talking about that. And it also, it was actually difficult, she has told us, to muster a lot of support in the union for these kinds of fights. Not everybody supported them. Not all the women members supported them. So you had to do an incredible amount of work in the union saying why this is important, and why women should have the right to be tidy, professional looking, and so on, but why they should not get a 50-page manual telling them what color their underwear should be, or how they should wear their hair, or this or that, which was all part of the regulation at the time of flight attendants. So you had to have the membership behind you, as Senka told us. You had to do this educational work. You had to fight on a legal front as well. And even when you got to the legal front, you might not always win. I mean, we can talk about a lot of legal battles around labor that were failures in the short term, but in the long term, they had a political impact because they exposed the inequalities and the absurdities and the sexism of the system. So, I think Senka came away from that discipline being even more respected in the union for her human rights work. So the employer was not really making a very smart move, I must say. And ironically, the employer kept complaining that, that women were going to be, biased against the company. Yeah, they were. They wrote letters to the company saying, why are you treating your employees like this? So it was a backlash they didn't expect, and maybe it spoke to the growing feminist feeling of the time. That's just one battle of many, right, Julia?
Yeah, I mean, I think the flight attendants are interesting because it touches on a lot of the things that I think, even with Leslie and Pam talking about, like the sexualization. I'd be curious to hear, Pam, you say if that came up at all in your interviews. And that's another question about timing. Like, I don't know if at that time with the women that you were interviewing, articulating, I mean, like, I have no doubt they were experiencing some of the sexual harassment and discrimination, but whether they were articulating it in that way at that time would be interesting, as opposed to talking to auto workers today. But then I just think about even this recent strike with flight attendants about, the unpaid work. How much is that tied up with gender and the fact that, yes, of course, there's more men working as flight attendants, but it's still predominantly female industry. And it's viewed as a caring occupation, even though, as Joan and I are constantly reminding ourselves, we're both terrified flyers, their primary role is safety. If a plane goes down, it's not pilot evacuating you from the plane, it's flight attendants. So first and foremost, their role is as safety professionals, but yet they're not treated as such, right? And this is wrapped up with that history of sexualization, of marketing them as part of, luring people into air travel in the early years, was selling them on the experience of having young, beautiful women providing you service on fine china. I mean, now compare that with what flying is like these days. Not that I'm hearkening back. We don't want to go back to the days of, mini skirts on jet planes, but it would be nice to at least have legroom. But yeah, and I think about, like, Leslie, what you were saying about the treatment of sessional instructors. It's not surprising to me, and I don't have the stats, it sounds like you might, that it's predominantly women, in these roles, right? And it's funny because I think back to a couple of years ago, Joan, I think you were there. Someone made this comment about, the proliferation of contract instructors in universities. And they made a comment saying, like, I bet you in 5 years, this is going to be predominantly women. Because we think about, who's able to move, who's able to travel around for these jobs for longer contracts, right? And so I think, again, the flight attendants, they're interesting. And of course, I think there's something, even we get caught up as researchers in the allure of airline travel and all the things that come with that. But I think they touch on a lot of issues. And I think, again, if we think about the strike recently, it hit a nerve with people. Like the issues they were fighting for, where they were talking about the ability to not be overtly sexually harassed or marketed as part of your airline's promotions, or to be paid for the work that you're doing. Like, I think they really struck a nerve with the public because people can relate to that, even if they're not flight attendants. So yeah, Leslie or Pam, if you also want to add, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I'm thinking of, as you're talking, I'm thinking of Arlie Hochschild's work on emotional labor. I'm wondering about the emotional labor that flight attendants perform. I remember one passage from Arlie Hochschild's book. I think it's called The Commercialization of Feeling, something similar to that. The flight attendant, I guess back then stewardess, was told by a male passenger to smile. Asked, why aren't you smiling? And she said, you smile and then you hold this for, X number of hours. Hold the smile. So there's a great, and we don't even think about the emotional labor that so many women perform now. I've talked to personal support workers, for example, especially those who work with the elderly, and they talk about how they are there for, it's extremely difficult work. And they are there in some ways just to keep up some social interaction for the elderly person they're visiting. And then elderly people die. And it is extremely stressful. To witness that, to form a relationship with someone and then have to cope with or grieve the loss of that person. So I think we need to pay more attention to the emotional labor that's involved in so many women's jobs. And I'd also say, in thinking about auto workers way back in the 1930s and 40s, many of them called what we would now view as sexual violence, they called it favoritism, which sounds a lot more innocuous than sexual violence. And those workplaces were highly sexualized. Especially with the entry of women into the plants temporarily. And then even when women won the right to enter men's jobs, when male-female job classifications were eliminated and women began to enter some areas which were, for example, in the skilled trades. Men, I guess, demonstrated their contempt in many cases, not all, but their sense of ownership of the job through sexualizing women, the women who entered the skilled trades. And there would be pinups everywhere, for example. So then the women at that point in time, 1970s, 1980s, referred to it as sexual harassment. So the same kinds of behaviors in many ways, but having the language to describe the behavior is very important, very powerful.
Well, thanks. I mean, when I talk to some of the older part-time workers at the post office and they talk about favoritism, I think I need to relook at, in light of what you said, is that favoritism was a terrible euphemism for terrible stuff. But Leslie, I mean, you talked because you just did research about, women's extra burdens and stuff, and people are talking about that throughout working life, and how when we address the history of women and work, we also have to address that. So can you talk a bit more about it?
Well, would you like a bit more detail about the extra burden and stress? Or
Yeah. I mean, what you found, because especially during COVID, a lot of women were caring for patients and their families, and
yes, so for my research focused on that, there has been a lot of attention and realization. This has also come through other scholars as well, who have noted about the intense workload as well as the stress load. And we also know too, if you look at what happened and what also got into the media, a lot of women also took CERB because they were unable to manage it, and then they struggled to get back to work. So there still are these ongoing issues with that unpaid labor and how it's still expected to this day, even though most households are dual income earners, but there's still this expectation, if it is a heterosexual relationship, that the female conducts the child caring within the household and the male does the outside. But we know that that impacts your ability to take care of yourself, your leisure time, and how that then would also impact your time at work. And then also if you are working in the healthcare field during the time, or you were a teacher, there was extra burdens and stress loads going on for that as well, trying to navigate and support students or individuals who perhaps were actually struggling with the virus itself.
so important. Do any of you have any sort of other comments, or do you want me to ask another question? So, and I think we've already touched on it a bit, because when you talk about the grievance procedure in court cases, but how have women's lived experiences, whether in factories, homes, offices, or in informal labor, because I think Leslie's talked about that, but shaped the evolution of labor rights, or have they? Anyone want to go first?
Order is working. Or Joan, you always have to go first then.
If people aren't, I mean, I think that there's one trend that we see emerging in the labor force. Leslie talked about it, which is precarity. More and more people are becoming precarious. But I actually think a lot of women's work has been historically precarious, and that, I mean, I remember an argument with all some of these labor men who were saying this, and this. And we were saying, but we women have been saying this is happening to women for years. So could you talk about how some of women's work has always been precarious historically?
Here you go, Joan. I'll mix it up. I'll jump in there first just to kind of start things off. I think especially for historians, this has been a real kind of, Joan was talking about the wave metaphor. I would say also the discussion of precarity is something that's also for labor historians been a little frustrating, and probably also for women's historians, because much of the discussion about precarity that we're hearing about talks as if it's a new thing. And of course, there's been changes, and it's true that many groups of workers that in the past might not have been considered precarious or in recent past, but are now experiencing that. So it has changed. Like, things change over time. But I think it's really important, as you kind of intimated there, Marion, and again, I'm sure the co-panelists will weigh in saying that really, in many ways, what we refer to as kind of the post-war period, that kind of golden age of post-war capitalism, golden for some people, in the 1940s to 1970s, that was kind of an anomaly. Like, for long periods of time, most work was precarious, but we've kind of come to view it as just, that became the norm. Like, that's what everyone thought. There's this time period where everyone had a 40-hour-a-week permanent job with one employer with a full pension and benefits. And for many groups, many marginalized groups, women, Black workers, Indigenous workers, workers with disabilities, that's just not been the case, if ever, and maybe for a brief period of time. And so I think it's a really good question to bring up. So I'll stop there and let other folks weigh in. But I think it's really important to always historicize, but especially this conversation about precarity.
I can jump in if you want and just enlarge on that a bit, because one of the questions was, what are the kind of, barriers to women's organizing? And if you go back, I'm going to go back to the early 20th century. The structural nature of women's work, which was often precarious, uncertain, was one of the main barriers to women being able to organize at the time, aside from the fact that the trade union movement was not very sympathetic, at least in the early 20th century. It was more sympathetic in the 19th century when the Knights of Labor were around. But women were in jobs that were just isolated from each other. They worked in small workplaces. I mean, the majority of women before World War I were probably domestic servants, single servants in people's houses. You just can't organize that group. They were in small workplaces, like very small garment shops. They were designated unskilled, even if we might think what they were doing was skilled, they were always seen as unskilled. So that that kind of precarious, difficult existence, and an existence where they knew their paycheck was needed by their families, whether or not they were single women or the few married women working, that was a family economy that everybody, contributed the paycheck to. So the structural barriers to organizing were really quite strong. And then you had layered on top of that the kind of ideological barriers. I mean, Pam mentioned that, there was a time when married women were fired. Even aside from the legal questions about, firing people, there was an ideology of domesticity, which tended to see a male breadwinner and female, looking after family care. They wouldn't have called it mother work at the time, but it was mother work. It was work. And for a lot of working families, it was actually quite arduous work, before washing machines and so on. So women took a lot of pride in that work. But that ideology of domesticity and the ideology of the male breadwinner persisted through a lot of the 20th century, and it was very difficult to dislodge. When you get to the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, one of the best union briefs came from CUPE, which is not surprising because the president was Grace Hartman, who was a feminist. But, they identified this problem as very, very serious because they couldn't get all of their membership to understand women work, all women work, and we can't make distinctions, and that married women have a right to work and a right to the same, wages and so on. And that was 1968, right? So that ideological barrier remained for a long time. And I would say, lastly, there was a lot of women faced financial barriers simply because their work was often very precarious or was seasonal and so on. Their paycheck was needed. It was not easy to go out on strike. It was not easy to stand up and protest. And that kind of precarious seasonal labor was very true of certain groups, like Indigenous women, for example, in the West, who pieced together different kinds of work to survive in the 20th century. So we have to, I think Julie's right. We have to think about precarity, but also how it's changed over time, how we deal with it over time, how it goes in and out of certain occupations. But for women, it was a recurring problem. And the fact that women stood up and protested in the face of these ideological and financial and structural barriers, I think makes us think about how courageous they really were.
Pam or Leslie, do you have sort of any comments about precarity existing over time and the way it was structured?
Well, I would just echo what Joan said about precarity existing from the early 20, well, even before the early 20th century, always existing for women workers. I mean, workers would talk about how their employment was very much contingent on their husband's employment. When their husband became unemployed, that they would have to look for a job. When a child was born, they would leave the job and out of financial necessity would have to return to the job. When a husband died, they had no choice but to seek whatever kind of work was available to them and to support their families. That myth of the male breadwinner was so powerful and pervasive. And the ideology, as Joan mentioned, the ideology of domesticity was equally strong and very much linked to the myth of the male breadwinner. But I turned your question slightly around and looking more recently at a larger group of women, because as we all know, we can't just talk about one experience for women workers. I think about, I teach a course this today on immigration and settlement and diaspora. And so this is all, very much on my mind. I think about the temporary foreign workers, very different groups of women, and changing, these groups of women, the country of origin has changed over time. And they are, they are extremely vulnerable, and because of their precarity, and they have no health care. They have no, they are not protected by labor legislation. That's often, well, up until recently, dependent on one employer, had to remain with one employer. Now, have to remain within the sector. Immigration policy is always changing. I think of the different kinds of precarity, I would say, among different groups of workers. And I want to leave time for Leslie.
So I also would like to echo what everyone has been saying, including what Pam just said about the intersectional lens tied to precarity. I have always found, and I'm sure some of my panelists also agree, whenever teaching a labor or work-related course and you receive that paper that says that when women started to work, you kind of have that cringe of, but they've always been working, and you have to educate your students. And even if you've made it clear in the classroom before the assignments due, you still get that paper to try to break down that women have always worked. Maybe it's not the same way as this perceived notion about male breadwinner, or even that standard 9-to-5 job that I don't think most of us work at all. That's most likely even in attendance today. So I think it's important to acknowledge just that women's work has been different. And I feel like that's still coming through to the state, which is why I feel there's more women who tend to work in precarious work, because we still haven't addressed some systemic barriers in society.
This has been so good. What I'm going to do now is sort of, without sort of any topic, is like give the speakers a chance to sort of respond to anything or to add anything that you may want to add, because what I've learned from here is that women have always worked, women have always resisted, but we also have to look at so many different competing pressures, competing norms, and that work doesn't look the same for all women, depending on your whether you have kids, whether you're an Indigenous woman, whether you're racialized or a Black woman, work may look very different. But I like, but I come up with this idea of women hiding, their wedding rings when they're going to work as a form of resistance. I think that's lovely. But does anyone want to start kind of to wrap up this quite interesting discussion?
Well, I'll save Joan from going first. Just some brief thoughts. I think about unfinished struggles. For example, first of all, I want to mention that there have been some incredible leaders, labor leaders, and I think, Joan already mentioned Grace Hartman, but history is about the past and present. So I also want to mention, I know Marion, you know her, Jan Simpson, who is the first Black woman president of major union, Cup W, your union. Has done an incredible job and is an incredible person. And Jenny On, who became an Asian woman of Korean descent, who became assistant to the president in the late 1990s of Unifor, CAW Unifor. But I also want to say that there is Effie Baldwin, and nobody knows Effie Baldwin. But she protested against, in the auto plants, against the way she was treated. She referred to her experience as a nervous breakdown, as many women did back then. When they were, when they were faced with production quotas, they said, "Oh, that gave me a nervous breakdown." And that was the language that they used. Now, the unfinished struggles. I think that there are many unfinished struggles. I think we need to, maybe I'll just use that old feminist term, give voice to those who have been marginalized. And I don't mean like we as researchers are going to enable women or empower women. I think we need to listen to the voices that haven't been heard. And that's what this project, I know Nancy, and I'm going to mispronounce your name, Nancy. That's why I'm so hesitant. What's the correct pronunciation of Nancy's last name?
Yanovicek.
There she is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks you. Who is the principal investigator of this project that we keep referring to at the University of Calgary? This is what we're trying to do. Bring those voices to public history.
And I think that's so much about labor history, bringing women's labor history, bringing the voices and struggles. I'm a longtime trade unionist. I've never heard of Effie Baldwin.
Effie Baldwin.
Yeah.
And she never married. She stayed working at General Motors for a long time. And she is one of those women, a significant number of women who never married because they wanted to retain their employment.
Wow. Someone else wants to go next?
Joan, you're unmuted, so I thought you were going to go next. Go.
Sure, I'll go next.
Yeah.
There's so many unfinished struggles. And one, I think, is just getting this history out. It's really important that we widen the view of women's history to take in the history of work and labor struggles. I think one thing we can do is support ongoing struggles. And we don't live in good times. I'm sorry, but I know old people always say things were better in the past, but sometimes they felt more hopeful in the 1970s than they do now. So we have to support women in their ongoing struggles. And I would say if there's one thing we should support, it's allowing women to join unions. That immediately raises the question that some women, like the temporary foreign workers that Pam was talking about, cannot easily join a union. But it is one way, at least, that women can protect themselves in these times and organize collectively to secure better wages. And you do have better wages, better benefits, and more protections in a union. So we have to support current struggles. And I would say the last thing is, and this is very hard, we have to think collectively and almost in a utopian way. We have to think that there is an alternative. And as some of you know, Margaret Thatcher was famous for saying there is no alternative to this kind of capitalism. Well, we have to say there is an alternative. And there is an alternative for working people, that we don't need to organize work the way it is. And there's an alternative for women, like having free universal childcare, which is something I care deeply about. So we can't lose our hope that organizing collectively might actually change the conditions of work for women today.
Thank
That
you.
might be a lesson from history too.
I think it's a lesson to us all, or
Yeah.
a reminder to us all. I mean, unionization by far is the best way women can raise their wages and benefits.
Yeah.
What
What do others think?
Leslie or Julia?
Leslie, if you want to go ahead, and then I can go. Or
Sure, I'll go quickly. I know I'm aware of time. So I just think it's important that we need to learn from our history as well as uncover history that has never been fully brought to the table in order to make changes to our current labor struggles. There's a lot we've talked about precarious employment. It's because of things haven't been addressed to make it more equal across the board from the past. So we just need to learn from our past in order to improve our future, and we can't forget it, which is why this is a great initiative.
Okay.
yeah, I'll just kind of pick up on what everybody has said here. A lot of it, I mean, I think I share with Joan. I mean, obviously I'm biased because of my research focus, but I do think that despite all the problems, and again, we haven't really gotten into those today. We've talked about sexism in the workplace, but let's be honest, the labor movement is, things have improved somewhat in some unions, but there's still many, issues with racism, sexism, ableism, all the isms are still a problem, right? I always tell my students the labor movement is at root, a group of people, and just like any other group of people, it's going to have all the same problems that we see with other groups of people. But the difference is there's mechanisms to change that. Most unions do have democracy in some form or fashion. And ultimately, at the end of the day, in terms of the power you get from a collective agreement to be able to change your working conditions, right? I mean, it's one of the most powerful tools working people have. And so I think, we don't shy away from the issues that exist for women and Black workers and all sorts of marginalized workers that exist in the labor movement. But I think we can look to the past of women. We're talking about women specifically, the way in which they've fought for space and the changes that have been made, because there have been changes, right? I think it's important, of course, to talk about the problems, but it's just as important to acknowledge the successes that have been made. I think you talk to some of the women, I think of your auto workers, Pam, they probably would be like shocked now to think like women's committees are just like a thing you have in unions. You're not fighting for that. You're not being jeered when you're speaking at a convention at the microphone. Like those things have changed somewhat, even though there's still always lots of work to do. And so I think about that things like this are really important for bringing to light the history of all the work that's gone in to make that happen. It didn't happen overnight. It happened through people pushing and demanding. And I guess related to that, what I would say is what I always take so much inspiration from a lot of this history, in terms of women's labor history, is like other things, people didn't follow the rules. Like things seem now like, of course, auto workers could unionize. That's insane. Like when we think of a unionized worker, even though increasingly it's a public sector, it's a woman in the public sector. When I talk to students, they still think of an auto worker. That's so hard to dislodge, right? The idea that a union member is an auto worker. But they couldn't organize either. And so I think what's inspiring about even the failures, as Joan said, from women's labor history, even the failed strikes, all of these things, is that all those things have to happen for things to finally change. And so I think it's such an important history to study. The fight for mat leave, someone mentioned, it wasn't the first time someone had thought like, maybe we should have mat leave. That Cup W strike was the result of, I think, whoever said at the beginning, maybe Deborah, all the little movements and little actions at the time had to come together for that. And so I just think it's really important to look at the past to understand both the successes and the failures, because they all teach us something about what's possible. And as Joan said, like we can do better even if we're not doing better. And these problems aren't new too, I think, right? Like things look differently now, but women have been facing some of these issues for a long time and have thought creatively about how to address them, and we can learn from that. Hopefully that ends with a bit of hope. Is that hopeful? I hope everyone.
Yeah.
In these
I want to thank the panelists. I think I've learned a lot. I've learned women. I mean, it's reminded me women have always worked. Women have always resisted, and we resisted in big ways and in little ways, but we resisted in ways that have made life better for us and for other people, and that all these quote unquote, a lot of these quote unquote new trends in work aren't really new trends, but they're just repackaged trends. And that, so I want to thank the Women's History Project and turn it over to Deborah.
Thank you very much, Marian. Thank you all. What an interesting discussion. Then there's a lot to think about, the intersections between history and work and quiet resistance and more active advocacy, challenging barriers then, now, and likely in the future. We've had a stellar panel, but I also want to point out that we have also had some really important people join us as participants, including Lorna Marsden, who dropped in, and Judy Rebick, both previous presidents of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women. Linda Silver-Dranoff, who is a family law lawyer that was writing Ask a Lawyer for Homemaker magazine back in the 70s and 80s.
Oh, it was actually Chatelaine.
Sorry?
Chatelaine.
Oh,
not
Chatelaine, I'm
Homemaker.
sorry. I'm sorry,
okay.
Linda. I'm sorry, Linda. Beatrice Kelleher-Raffel, who's a really good friend of mine with Famous Five Foundation and Famous Five Ottawa. Nancy from University of Calgary. I'm not going to try and say your name, but I'm looking forward to meeting you next week. I would like the participants who are still here to actually, in the chat, introduce yourselves. Who are you? Where are you from? And just mention something, because I think the work that you do before you come here, or why are you here? Like, just write a little bit about yourselves, because we'd like to sort of track who attends our events, and the work that you do in your communities is very, very important. So please take a moment and introduce yourselves in the chat. As I mentioned before, I'm really interested in the Oral History Project. We have 1,000 voices, 1,000 stories. I've interviewed Linda Silver-Dranoff and Judy Rebick and Michelle Landsberg and 14 others. Season 2 is in development. And there is a way to develop oral history to make it more popular. It's not just about women's archives and libraries that nobody but students and academics and researchers go into, but how can we actually turn them into something, podcast, make it more relevant. And many of the oral histories that are at the University of Ottawa, who's one of our partners, a lot of the women have since passed away. So getting their voices out front would be really important. So I'm really, really keen on the discussion about oral history and how important it is. Many thanks again to Marian and Joan, Pamela, Leslie, and Julia. Marian, you did a fabulous job with the moderating, and I'm very, very grateful. I'd like to again thank my board and our team, and to our funders and donors. Sometimes it feels like we're living on fumes. History is not high on the list of prospective sponsors and partners, but history still is important. And to conclude, our next session is on April the 9th, and it's called Voices Rising, Activism and the Modern Workplace. And I think somebody's going to put in the chat a link to register. And then our third session will talk about the future of work and how women can continue to challenge and advocate and really reshape work, thinking about the lessons from history, what we're doing today, and how can we apply it tomorrow, because there are changes. So those unfinished struggles that you talk about, we're very mindful that history is relevant yesterday as it is today, and certainly as it is tomorrow. So again, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.